The fork stopped halfway to Leonid Corvin's mouth when the restaurant door opened and a child walked in alone. No parent followed. No guardian appeared behind her small frame. Just a 7-year-old girl in a faded red dress, scanning the dim interior with eyes that had learned to calculate danger before learning multiplication tables. The waiter moved to intercept, his professional smile already forming the polite refusal, but Elsie Varon sidestepped him with practiced ease. She'd navigated worse obstacles than well-meaning staff. Her worn sneakers made no sound against the polished floor as she wove between tables where couples whispered over candlelight and businessmen sealed deals with handshakes. Leonid set down his silverware with deliberate precision, the soft clink echoing in his corner of the restaurant. He'd chosen this table for its strategic position, back to the wall, clear view of all entrances, proximity to the service door. Tonight, those instincts served a different purpose as he tracked the child's determined approach. The other diners hadn't noticed yet, too absorbed in their own carefully constructed worlds. A woman laughed at something her companion said while adjusting diamond earrings. An elderly couple shared tiramisu in comfortable silence. The pianist in the corner transitioned into something melancholic that matched the sound of distant waves against Monterey's rocky shore. Elsie stopped at his table without invitation, her small hands clutching a fabric pouch that bulged with the weight of coins. She didn't look around nervously or second-guess her choice. She'd made her decision before walking through that door, and children who lived with monsters learned not to waste time on hesitation. Leonid observed her with the same intensity he brought to business negotiations where millions changed hands. The simple ponytail holder barely containing her tangled hair, the dirt smudge on her left cheek shaped like a thumbprint, the way her shoulder blades pressed against the thin fabric of her dress as if wings had been clipped before they could fully form. She placed the pouch on his white linen napkin, the gesture formal despite her trembling fingers. The fabric was homemade, stitched with uneven threads in a pattern that suggested a child's craft project. It landed with a soft thud that somehow carried more weight than its physical presence warranted. "If I pay, can you scare the monsters in my house?" Her voice came out steady, practiced, as if she'd rehearsed this moment in front of a mirror until the words no longer shook. She met his gaze without flinching, and Leonid recognized that particular brand of courage, the kind born from having no other options left to try. The question hung in the air between them, while the restaurant continued its oblivious rhythm. A waiter refilled wine glasses at a nearby table. Someone requested the check. The pianist's melody shifted into something that sounded like rain falling on cobblestones, melancholic and inevitable. Leonid's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his dark eyes, a door opening to a room he'd locked years ago. He didn't reach for the pouch, didn't dismiss her with the wave of his hand that made grown men scatter. Instead, he leaned back in his chair with the careful movements of someone handling something fragile. "What kind of monsters?" His voice was lower than the ambient noise, forcing her to lean in slightly. He watched her process the question, saw the moment she decided whether to tell the truth or retreat into the safety of fantasy. Children who came to strangers for help had already exhausted every other avenue, the kind that comes when Mama leaves for work. Elsie's fingers twisted the hem of her dress, creating wrinkles in fabric that had been carefully ironed despite its age. She wears white like an angel and goes to the hospital when the sun goes down. That's when he shows up instead. The pronoun carried weight she didn't elaborate on, didn't need to. Leonid understood the language of fear spoken in careful omissions and strategic silences. He'd learned it himself once, in a different city and a different life, before he became the man others feared. "He smells like the bottles under the sink, the ones with skull pictures that Mama says are poison." Her voice dropped to a whisper, as if the monster might hear even across the distance of the city. His steps shake the floor. His voice makes the walls remember things they want to forget. She described the nightly ritual with the detachment of a witness reporting facts, how the door would slam, how the shouting started low and built like a storm gathering strength, how she'd learned to make herself small in the closet, breathing through her mouth so she wouldn't smell the alcohol that announced his arrival before his key turned the lock. Leonid's jaw tightened incrementally with each detail, a tension that started at his temples and worked down to his clenched hands. The other diners still laughed and ate and lived their insulated lives, unaware that a child was describing a war zone that happened every night in an ordinary apartment just miles from their comfortable homes. "Mama doesn't know I know," Elsie continued, her gaze dropping to the pouch between them. "She thinks I sleep through it. I put my pillow over my head like she taught me. but I still hear everything. The things he says about her uniform, about her shifts, about how she thinks she's too good now that she saves people. Leonid remained motionless, but his mind was calculating distances and timelines with the precision that had built his empire. The child before him represented a variable he hadn't anticipated when he'd chosen this particular evening for solitude. Her presence disrupted the careful equilibrium he maintained between his public face and the parts of himself he kept locked away. How much is in there? He gestured toward the pouch with his chin, still not touching it, as if physical contact would seal some unspoken contract. His question was gentle despite his reputation for voices that could freeze men mid-sentence. Elsie picked up the pouch and loosened the drawstring with small, careful fingers. She tipped the contents onto the table between his plate and wine glass, 3/4 that caught the candlelight and reflected it back like tiny shields. The coins rolled slightly before settling into stillness. I've been saving since summer. Pride crept into her voice alongside the fear. One from the couch cushions when he was sleeping. One from Mama's tip jar, but she has lots so she won't miss it. One from the fountain at the park, where people throw away wishes. The mathematics of her desperation laid out in 75 cents. Leonid had negotiated deals worth millions where men sweated over decimal points and interest rates. None of those transactions had carried the weight of these 3 coins stolen from forgotten places by a child who believed money could buy safety. That's not enough, he said quietly, watching her face begin to crumble before he continued. Because you can't pay for something like this. Not with coins, not with anything. He paused, letting the words settle. Pick them up. You've already paid more than anyone should have to. Elsie's confusion manifested in the slight tilt of her head, the way children process information that doesn't match their expectations. She'd prepared for rejection, maybe even for laughter. She hadn't prepared for this particular form of acceptance that came wrapped in negation. But I have to pay, she insisted, with the logic of someone who'd learned that nothing comes free. That's how it works. You can't just get things without giving something back. Mama says people who take without paying are... She stopped, searching for the word. Thieves, Leonid finished for her. Your mother is right, but this isn't a transaction, Elsie. He used her name though she hadn't offered it, and her eyes widened at the realization that he knew more than she'd told him. Information was his business, and even a child's arrival didn't happen in his presence without him learning the context. She gathered the coins with both hands, cradling them against her chest like they might escape. Her lips pressed together in a thin line that aged her face beyond its years. She'd come here with a plan, and adults who dismiss children's plans were just another kind of monster. Then how do I know you'll really do it? The question carried an accusation, a challenge that demanded proof before hope could be risked. She'd stopped believing in promises the same way some children stopped believing in fairy tales, through repeated disappointment that taught suspicion as survival. Leonid leaned forward, elbows on the table, bringing himself closer to her eye level. The movement was deliberate, calculated to convey seriousness without intimidation. He'd perfected the art of physical communication in rooms where words were weapons and silence was strategy. You don't, he said simply. You walk out of here and you go home, and you wait. Maybe nothing changes, maybe everything does, but you don't wait because I promised. You wait because you've already decided that's what you're going to do anyway. The truth of it settled between them like the coins had, a wait that couldn't be denied or dismissed. Elsie studied his face with the intensity of someone reading a map to survival, looking for the markers that distinguished safe territory from dangerous ground. Are you like him? Her voice barely carried across the table. The kind that hurts people who can't hurt back? It was the question beneath all her other questions, the real monster she was trying to identify. Leonid felt something crack in his chest, a fissure in the armor he'd welded shut years ago. Yes, he answered, because lies to children were their own form of violence, but not the same way, and not for the same reasons. She nodded slowly, accepting the complexity of an answer that acknowledged darkness without drowning in it. She understood that monsters came in different species, that some hunted and some protected, that the teeth were less important than the choice of what to bite. Okay. She backed away from the table with the same caution she'd approached, 3 steps that maintained visual contact before she turned. Her red dress caught the light as she moved toward the exit, a spot of color against the restaurant's muted elegance that seemed too bright, too insistent, too alive. The door closed behind Elsie with a whisper of hinges, and Leonid remained frozen in position. His wine glass sat untouched, condensation forming rings on the linen. His dinner had long gone cold, but the food had become irrelevant the moment small hands had placed hope on his table disguised as coins. The waiter approached hesitantly, reading the dangerous stillness in his best customer's posture. "Sir, shall I bring fresh pasta? Perhaps something else?" The offer hung unanswered while Leonid stared at the spot where a child had stood and asked him to fight monsters she couldn't name except through their effects. No. The single word carried finality that sent the waiter retreating. Leonid picked up his wine glass and set it down without drinking, a gesture empty of purpose but full of the need to move, to do something with hands that had forgotten how to be still when memories demanded attention. He'd been younger than Elsie when he learned that some doors don't open from the inside. His own mother had worked nights too. Different uniform, but same desperation, leaving him with a man whose fists taught lessons about power and helplessness. The apartment had been smaller, the city louder, but the mathematics of fear were universal and timeless. The pianist finished his set and began packing up, the sudden silence more noticeable than the music had been. Conversations at other tables filled the void with meaningless noise. Vacation plans, business complaints, gossip about people whose problems existed only in the narrow bandwidth of privilege. Leonid's phone buzzed against his chest, the vibration pulling him back to the present where territories needed managing and debts needed collecting. He ignored it. Let them wait. Let the empire run itself for one evening while he sat with the ghost of a child who'd looked at him and seen possibility instead of fear. The manager appeared at a respectful distance, concern creasing his forehead at the sight of untouched food. "Mr. Corvin, is everything satisfactory? Was there an issue with—" He gestured vaguely at the plate, at the table, at the disruption that everyone had pretended not to notice. "A child came to my table." Leonid's voice was steady, conversational even, but something in his tone made the manager stand straighter. "Red dress, 7 years old, alone. You saw her enter. You'll remember if she comes back. You'll always have a table for her, whatever she needs. Bill it to my account." The instruction was clear, the authority behind it unquestionable. The manager nodded rapidly, already making mental notes about staff training and protocols. Children didn't typically wander into his establishment unaccompanied, but now one had, and that made her significant in ways that required no further explanation. Leonid stood, leaving cash on the table that covered both his meal and ensured no questions would be asked. His movements were mechanical as he shrugged into his coat, each button fastened with the same precision he brought to every action. Control was the illusion he sold, but tonight it felt thinner than usual. Outside, the Monterey air carried salt and cold, the kind of coastal chill that seeped through expensive fabric and settled in bones. His car waited at the curb, driver alert, but Leonid waved him off. He needed to walk, needed the physical movement to process what sitting still couldn't resolve. The streets stretched empty before him, lit by street lamps that turned fog into gauze. His footsteps echoed against closed storefronts and darkened windows where families lived their ordinary lives. Somewhere in this city, Elsie Varon was going home to wait for monsters, trusting a stranger because she'd run out of alternatives. He'd built his reputation on being the monster others feared, the name whispered as warning, the presence that cleared rooms and ended arguments. Power was his currency, respect bought through careful cultivation of danger. But a child had looked past all of that and seen only a man who might be capable of protection. The irony wasn't lost on him, that violence in service of fear could be redirected toward safety, that the same hands that broke could also shield. The machinery of his empire ran on intimidation and control, carefully balanced to maintain order through the threat of consequences. One child had asked him to repurpose that machinery toward different ends. His phone buzzed again, persistent. He pulled it out and saw messages stacking up, issues that needed decisions, situations requiring his attention. The world he'd built didn't stop spinning because a girl had offered him 3/4 and asked for help. Business was business, and business continued. But he didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he stood on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, where waves crashed against rocks in perpetual violence that somehow sounded like peace. The ocean didn't care about territories or deals, or the careful architecture of power. It simply was, relentless and indifferent. Leonid thought about the closet where Elsie hid, pillow pressed against small ears, breathing through her mouth to avoid the smell of approaching danger. He thought about his own childhood closet, different location, but same purpose, where he'd learned that safety was something you built yourself, because no one was coming to save you. Maybe that's what she'd recognized in him, not the monster, but the survivor, The part that remembered what it meant to count ceiling cracks while waiting for storms to pass. The part that had promised itself, decades ago in another closet, that someday he'd be strong enough that no one could make him afraid again. He'd kept that promise. Now a child was asking him to extend its protection beyond himself, to be the intervention he'd once desperately needed, but never received. Morning arrived with Leonid already at his desk, the city below still wrapped in coastal fog that blurred the line between ocean and sky. He'd spent the night reviewing files that had nothing to do with business. Public records, hospital employee rosters, addresses in neighborhoods where hope fought losing battles against circumstance. Corinne Varon worked at Monterey Bay General, night shift rotation in the emergency department. Her employment record showed perfect attendance despite raising a daughter alone. The file his people compiled included details that painted a portrait of exhaustion, held together by necessity and love that refused to break. The man living in her apartment wasn't on the lease. Dennis Kruger, unemployed for 2 years, 3 drunk and disorderly charges dismissed, 1 domestic disturbance call that Corinne had refused to press charges for. The pattern was familiar, predictable, the kind of slow destruction that happened behind closed doors, while neighbors turned up their televisions. Leonid's assistant entered without knocking, reading his mood correctly enough to know that normal protocols were suspended. The surveillance team is in position. Apartment building has 12 units, exits covered, rotation scheduled every 6 hours. The report was efficient, professional, exactly what he'd requested at 4 a.m. "I want eyes only," Leonid clarified, his voice carrying the weight of instruction that left no room for interpretation. "No interference unless the child is in immediate physical danger. Document everything. Times, patterns, behavior. I need to understand the complete picture before deciding the appropriate response." The assistant nodded and retreated, leaving Leonid alone with information that transformed Elsie from abstraction into concrete reality. She attended Hawthorne Elementary. Teachers' notes mentioned frequent tiredness, occasional bruises explained as playground accidents. The school counselor had flagged concerns but lacked evidence for official intervention. The system's failure was documented in careful bureaucratic language that absolved everyone of responsibility, while a child learned to hide in closets. Leonid understood systems. He'd built his own parallel version that operated outside legal constraints but according to rules just as rigid. Justice was a concept with multiple interpretations. His phone displayed messages from associates expecting responses about shipments and territories. A restaurant owner needed resolution for protection payment disputes. A city councilman required reassurance about campaign contributions. The machinery of his empire demanded constant attention, but he found himself unable to care about any of it. Instead, he pulled up the surveillance feed on his laptop, watching the grainy footage of an apartment building entrance. People left for work, returned with groceries, lived their ordinary lives in ordinary ways. Nothing happened, which was precisely the point. He was establishing baseline behavior before patterns could be disrupted. At 7:45, Elsie emerged holding her mother's hand, the red dress replaced by school clothes that fit slightly better. Corinne walked her to the bus stop, kissed her forehead, waited until the yellow vehicle pulled away before turning back toward the building. Her posture suggested someone carrying weight invisible to casual observation. Leonid watched Corinne disappear inside, then checked the night shift report his team had compiled. She'd left for the hospital at 10:30 the previous evening. Dennis had arrived drunk at 11:15. Shouting began at 11:40 and continued intermittently until 1:30, when he'd passed out on the couch. The clinical documentation of violence felt obscene in its sterility. Behind those timestamps was a child pressed into a closet corner, counting minutes until silence meant temporary safety. Behind them was a woman choosing between staying to protect her daughter and working to keep them both housed and fed. Leonid closed the laptop with controlled force. He'd seen worse in his years building power from nothing, had participated in worse, if honesty demanded acknowledgement. But something about Elsie's 3/4 and her formal question had stripped away the comfortable distance he maintained between himself and the consequences of others' violence. His childhood memories surfaced without permission, fragments he'd buried under years of carefully constructed strength. His own mother's white uniform had been a waitress outfit, different profession, but same exhaustion. The man who'd hurt them both had different vices, but same fundamental cruelty that enjoyed power over those who couldn't fight back. He'd been powerless then, small and afraid and counting the days until he was big enough to make different choices. That boy had promised himself that strength would be the solution. that power would prevent repetition. Now he had both, more than he'd ever imagined possible, and a child was asking whether any of it could be repurposed toward protection. The morning stretched into afternoon while Leonid worked through legitimate business that funded his less legitimate operations. A shipping contract review, a real estate closing, a charitable foundation meeting where he played the role of reformed businessman giving back to the community. The performance was flawless, as always, but his mind kept returning to that apartment building, to the surveillance feeds updating in real time, to the knowledge that tonight would repeat last night's pattern, unless something fundamental changed. Dennis would drink, Corinne would work, Elsie would hide. The cycle would continue until it escalated into something the system couldn't ignore, by which point intervention would come too late. At 6:30, his phone buzzed with an alert. Dennis had entered the building carrying 2 paper bags from a liquor store. The surveillance photo showed a man in his 40s gone soft around the middle, wearing stained clothes and an expression of entitled resentment. This was the monster Elsie had asked him to scare. Leonid stood at his office window watching sunset paint the bay in shades of amber and blood. The beauty felt like mockery, nature performing its indifferent cycle, while human suffering played out in apartments and alleyways. His reflection in the glass showed a man others feared, but tonight he saw only the boy he'd been, helpless, and hoping someone might notice. His phone rang with a call he'd been expecting. The target's established pattern, his head of security reported. Drinks start around 7, escalation by 9, passes out between midnight and 2. Mother's at work, girls alone with him. Same script every night for the past week we've been watching. What about extended family? Leonid asked, though he already knew the answer from the files. He needed to hear it confirmed, needed to exhaust every variable before implementing solutions that couldn't be reversed or explained. Mother's parents deceased, no siblings. Girl's father unknown, not listed on birth certificate. Corinne's isolated, no close friends we can identify. No support system beyond her hospital colleagues who don't know the home situation. Classic pattern of controlled isolation. The assessment was professional, detached, years of experience recognizing predatory dynamics. Leonid thanked him and ended the call. The isolation was strategic, whether Dennis understood his own tactics or simply followed instinct. Cut off support, create dependence, ensure the victim had nowhere to run. It was the same blueprint used by men who hurt women and children across every culture and economic class. He thought about Elsie walking into that restaurant alone, finding him among all the other diners, choosing to approach despite fear. That took calculation and courage most adults couldn't muster. She'd assessed her options, found them inadequate, and decided to gamble on a stranger who looked dangerous enough to fight other dangerous things. The intelligence behind her choice impressed him. She'd read him correctly, recognized that violence could be redirected, that monsters sometimes fought each other. She'd offered payment to formalize the transaction, understanding instinctively that people respected business arrangements more than charity. At 7 years old, she demonstrated strategic thinking that would serve her well if she survived long enough to use it. His assistant knocked and entered carrying a folder. The legal team finished the review. Dennis Kruger has no employment contract, no lease agreement, no legal claim to residence. Technically, he's a guest who's overstayed welcome. Eviction would be Corinne's right, but she'd need to file formally and wait for processing, which gives him weeks to retaliate, Leonid finished. The law's careful pace was designed to protect rights, but often left vulnerable people exposed. By the time paperwork processed and court dates arrived, damage would be done. The system worked for those who could afford to wait safely. Corinne and Elsie couldn't. He took the folder without opening it. The legal options were irrelevant. He'd already known they'd be inadequate before requesting analysis. Laws were tools for people with resources and time. Elsie had 3 quarters, and the amount of time it took for violence to escalate from shouting to something worse. There's an alternative approach, his assistant continued carefully. Kruger has outstanding warrants in Nevada, unpaid tickets, missed court dates. Anonymous tip to the right authorities could result in immediate arrest. Transport across state lines for processing, legal complications that would keep him occupied for weeks minimum. It was clever, the kind of solution that worked within technical legality while achieving desired outcomes. Leonid considered it, running calculations about effectiveness and sustainability. Warrants would remove Dennis temporarily, but temporary wasn't enough. Men like him always came back, unless given compelling reason to stay away. What about employment opportunities? Leonid asked. Something that requires immediate relocation, long-term commitment, too lucrative to refuse? He was thinking about construction projects in Alaska, oil rig rotations, positions that put significant geography between Dennis and Monterey. His assistant's expression shifted to understanding. We have a development project in North Dakota, housing construction for energy workers. Labor shortage, immediate need, comprehensive benefits package, on-site housing included, contract requires 6-month minimum commitment. We could arrange an offer through legitimate channels, make it appear opportunistic rather than engineered. The pieces assembled themselves into elegant solution. Dennis would see opportunity where others saw manipulation. Pride would make him accept the chance to prove himself capable, to escape his current situation while claiming it as choice rather than failure. He'd leave Corinne and Elsie behind without admitting he'd been maneuvered into departure. Make it happen, Leonid instructed. But I want verification of arrival and sustained presence. If he attempts to return early, I need immediate notification. The unspoken threat hung between them, that other, less gentle measures would be implemented if this approach failed. His assistant left with the efficiency that made him valuable. Leonid returned to the window where full darkness had replaced sunset, city lights reflecting off the bay like scattered stars. Somewhere in that constellation of buildings, Elsie was probably in her closet already, hands over ears, waiting for shouting to subside into unconscious silence. The intervention he was orchestrating would take days to implement. Background checks to maintain authenticity, contract preparation, the careful theater of recruitment that appeared coincidental. Days during which the nightly pattern would continue, during which a child would hide and hope that the stranger she'd paid 3/4 had heard her request. He'd promised nothing, given her no timeline or guarantee. That was deliberate. Promises created expectations, and expectations led to disappointment when reality fell short. But he'd also told her to wait, to trust that maybe everything would change. That implied commitment even without explicit vow. The recruitment call came on Wednesday morning, Dennis answering his phone with the thick voice of someone sleeping off the previous night's drinking. Leonid listened to the recorded conversation later, hearing his employee pitch the opportunity with perfect balance of urgency and enticement. Position starts Monday, signing bonus for immediate acceptance, transportation arranged. Dennis's skepticism was audible through his hangover. Why me? I haven't worked construction in years. The question carried suspicion that came from knowing he hadn't earned good fortune through effort or merit. Men who'd given up trying, recognized when circumstances exceeded reasonable luck. Your name came through contractor referrals. The recruiter lied smoothly. Projects behind schedule. We're reaching out to anyone with relevant experience. Frankly, we're desperate. You'd be doing us a favor. The psychology was perfect, appealing to ego while explaining away the convenience of timing. Leonid heard Dennis grunt, then movement suggesting he was getting up, probably looking around the apartment that represented his stagnation. What's the pay? The shift from suspicion to interest was palpable, greed overriding caution the way it usually did when people wanted reasons to believe. The recruiter named a figure that was generous but not suspiciously so, then added details about housing and meal plans. You'd bank most of your paycheck since expenses are covered. 6 months would set you up pretty well. The promise of financial reset dangled like salvation to someone who'd been living off his girlfriend's nursing salary. I need to think about it, Dennis said, but his voice had already committed. The thinking was performance, maintaining illusion of careful consideration. By that afternoon, he'd called back to accept. His decision presented as generous. He was doing them a favor by taking the job. Leonid closed the recording file with grim satisfaction. Friday's paperwork would be completed by courier. Saturday, Dennis would sign contracts. Sunday, a company vehicle would arrive to transport him north. Monday morning, Corinne would wake to find him gone with only a note explaining his sudden opportunity. The timeline gave Leonid 48 hours to ensure every detail aligned perfectly. His people verified the North Dakota project existed, that housing assignments were legitimate, that Dennis's name appeared properly in employment databases. The fiction had to withstand scrutiny if questioned, though Dennis wouldn't question. He'd take credit for seizing initiative. Thursday evening, Leonid reviewed surveillance footage showing Dennis celebrating his imminent departure. He'd bought cheaper whiskey this time, presumably saving money, drinking with expansive gestures that suggested he was explaining his plans to an imaginary audience. Corinne worked her shift unaware that her home situation was being quietly dismantled. Elsie appeared in one frame, moving quickly through the living room toward her bedroom. The timestamp showed 8:30, earlier than her usual retreat. She'd learned to read the warning signs, to disappear before alcohol transformed Dennis from merely unpleasant into actively dangerous. Survival skills no child should need to master. Leonid watched her close the bedroom door, saw the light go off moments later. She'd be in the closet now, pillow arranged, breathing controlled, counting the minutes until safety. She didn't know yet that this was among the last times she'd need to hide. The not knowing bothered him more than he'd expected. He considered sending a message somehow, a sign that things were changing, that her payment had been accepted and services rendered. But anonymity was crucial for the intervention to appear natural rather than orchestrated. She'd understand eventually, or she wouldn't. Either way, she'd be safer. Friday brought contract signatures and background verifications that his people had carefully manipulated to show Dennis as qualified candidate. The paperwork was pristine, every detail cross-referenced and confirmed. If anyone investigated, they'd find legitimate employment process, not evidence of manufactured opportunity. Saturday morning, Dennis packed with the enthusiasm of someone escaping, rather than embracing opportunity. Surveillance showed him taking clothes and personal items while leaving most possessions behind. He didn't consult Corinne about the decision, didn't ask whether sudden departure might inconvenience her. His note would be discovered later, information presented as accomplished fact, rather than discussed choice. Leonid spent Saturday afternoon at his legitimate business office, maintaining appearances through meetings about quarterly projections and expansion proposals. His public persona required consistent performance. The reformed entrepreneur who'd left questionable beginnings behind for respectable commerce. No one could connect that figure to the invisible hand rearranging a troubled family's circumstances. By Saturday evening, everything was positioned for Sunday's departure. The vehicle was scheduled, the route planned, the supervisor in North Dakota briefed to expect a worker who'd require close monitoring. Dennis would find his new job demanding, his housing remote, his opportunities for leaving, limited by geography and contract obligations. Sunday morning arrived with fog so thick, it erased the line between sea and sky. Leonid stood at his window watching nothing, thinking about a child who'd be waking soon to discover that monsters could disappear as suddenly as they arrived. She'd asked if he could scare them away. Instead, he'd removed them entirely, which was close enough to the same thing. His phone buzzed with confirmation at 9:15. Dennis was in the vehicle heading north, cheerful and oblivious. The driver would deliver him to the work site by late afternoon, where he'd sign additional paperwork and be shown to his assigned quarters. By Monday morning, he'd be integrated into a system that expected early starts and exhausting days that left little energy for drinking or contemplating return. Leonid allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before moving to the next phase. Removal was only half the solution. Now came the harder part, ensuring Corinne and Elsie could rebuild without the weight that had been crushing them. That would require more subtle intervention, more careful orchestration of circumstances that appeared fortunate rather than arranged. Monday morning brought the kind of silence that Corinne Varon had forgotten existed. She woke to sunlight filtering through curtains without the background noise of snoring from the couch, without the smell of stale alcohol permeating the apartment. The absence was so complete it felt like presence, like the space itself was holding its breath. Dennis's note lay on the kitchen counter where he'd left it, explaining nothing while claiming everything. The words talked about opportunity and fresh starts, about how he needed to take this chance for both of them. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what he was leaving behind, just the assumption that she'd understand his departure as reasonable rather than abandonment. Corinne read it twice, her nursing-trained mind automatically cataloging the inconsistencies. Dennis hadn't mentioned job searching, hadn't talked about North Dakota, hadn't shown ambition beyond his next drink in the 2 years he'd occupied her space. The sudden employment made no sense, but she wasn't going to question good fortune that arrived without warning. Elsie emerged from her bedroom with cautious steps, reading her mother's expression for signs of crisis. The child had learned to navigate moods the way sailors read weather, always calculating the safest course through potentially dangerous conditions. Her eyes found the note, then moved to her mother's face, waiting for interpretation. "He's gone," Corinne said simply, watching her daughter process the information with the careful control of someone who'd learned not to show too much hope. "Some job in North Dakota. Left this morning." She held up the note as evidence, as if either of them needed proof of the miraculous quiet that had replaced their nightly soundtrack of violence. Elsie nodded slowly, her 7-year-old mind working through implications with impressive speed. Is he coming back? The question was practical rather than emotional, seeking information about whether this was temporary reprieve or permanent liberation. She'd survived long enough to know that good things often reversed themselves without warning. "I don't know," Corinne answered honestly, refusing to make promises she couldn't guarantee. "The note says 6 months minimum, maybe longer. We'll figure it out as we go." She pulled her daughter close, feeling the small body relax incrementally against her, tension dissolving in stages like ice thawing under hesitant sun. They ate breakfast together without rushing, without the hypervigilance that usually accompanied their mornings. Corinne made pancakes shaped like stars, something she hadn't had the energy for in months. Elsie ate slowly, savoring each bite as if committing the taste of peace to memory against future need. At the hospital that evening, Corinne's colleagues noticed the difference in her demeanor before she mentioned anything. "You seem lighter," one of the other nurses observed during their shift change. "Good weekend?" The question was casual, but Corinne heard the underlying concern that came from people who'd witnessed her gradual dimming over the past 2 years. She told them about Dennis's departure with careful neutrality, not wanting to invite questions about why his leaving felt more like rescue than loss. They offered congratulations that carried relief, confirming what she'd suspected, that her situation had been more obvious than she'd hoped, that people had noticed and worried without knowing how to intervene. The week passed in suspended disbelief. Corinne waited for the other shoe to drop, for Dennis to call drunk and angry, demanding she wire money for his return. But the calls never came. Her phone stayed quiet except for hospital scheduling and Elsie's school reminders, the absence of crisis so unfamiliar it felt almost threatening. By Friday, she allowed herself to believe the change might be permanent. She cleaned the apartment thoroughly, erasing the traces of occupation that had made her feel like a guest in her own home. Dennis's belongings went into boxes that she stored in the building's basement, accessible if needed, but removed from her immediate environment. Elsie helped with the cleaning, attacking dust and disorder, with the fierce determination of someone reclaiming territory. She scrubbed baseboards and organized closets, transforming the space from merely clean to actually renewed. The closet where she'd hidden became storage for board games, its purpose reimagined from refuge to recreation. Saturday brought an envelope delivered by courier to their building. Corinne opened it to find a formal letter from Monterey Bay General's administration office, notification that an anonymous donor had established a grant fund for nursing staff continuing education. She'd been selected as one of the first recipients based on her work performance and tenure. The grant covered tuition for advanced certification courses, textbooks, even childcare expenses during class time. The amount was generous enough to be life-changing but not so excessive as to feel suspicious. Corinne read the letter 3 times, searching for catches or conditions, finding none beyond the requirement that she maintain her current employment status. She didn't question the timing, didn't wonder why good fortune had suddenly decided to notice her existence. People who'd lived on the edge of survival learned to accept unexpected gifts without overthinking their origins. The universe had taken something away and replaced it with something better. That was enough. Monday afternoon, flowers arrived at the nurse's station, addressed simply to Corinne. No card accompanied them, just a beautiful arrangement of white orchids and deep blue irises that the other nurses admired with knowing looks. "Someone's interested," one teased, but Corinne dismissed the speculation even as something in her chest tightened with possibility. That evening, she found a business card tucked into her hospital locker. No name, just a phone number written in precise handwriting, and below it a single word: protected. The message was clear enough despite its brevity. Someone was watching. Someone had intervened. Someone wanted her to know that the changes weren't coincidental but arranged. Corinne held the card for a long moment, her mind connecting pieces she deliberately avoided assembling. Elsie's unexplained contentment the week before Dennis left, the convenient job offer, the grant, the flowers, all of it orbiting around the same unnamed center, the same invisible hand guiding circumstances toward her benefit. 2 weeks after Dennis's departure, Corinne found an envelope in her mailbox containing payment confirmation for utilities she knew she hadn't paid yet. The electric company letterhead looked official. The account number matched hers, but the payment source was listed as Anonymous Community Assistance Program. She called to verify, expecting error, receiving only confirmation that her account was current for the next 3 months. The pattern continued with quiet persistence. Her car, which had been making concerning noises for months, was repaired while she worked a double shift. The mechanic explained that someone had prepaid the service, providing only instructions that the vehicle should receive complete maintenance and safety inspection. The final bill, over $800, showed a balance of zero. Elsie's school sent a letter about a new scholarship program, funding extracurricular activities for qualifying students. Art supplies, music lessons, sports equipment, all covered by an endowment from an unnamed local benefactor. The counselor mentioned during pickup that Elsie had been selected based on her academic resilience and the school's awareness of her home situation improving recently. Corinne recognized the architecture of intervention now, saw the careful structure behind seemingly random fortune. Someone with resources and reach was systematically removing obstacles from her path, creating space for her to breathe without the constant weight of financial crisis. The gifts were practical rather than extravagant, addressing real needs without drawing attention or creating dependence. She thought about the business card often, the single word protected, implying both past action and ongoing commitment. Part of her wanted to call the number, to demand explanations for generosity she hadn't asked for and didn't know how to repay. But larger part understood that some things were better left unexamined, that gratitude didn't require complete understanding. One evening in late October, Corinne arrived at the hospital to find upgraded parking access, her previous spot in the distant lot, replaced with reserved space near the employee entrance. Security explained that senior staff with exemplary records were being given priority parking for safety reasons. Her name had been on the list provided by administration. The small considerations accumulated into significant quality of life improvements. She no longer spent 20 minutes walking through dark parking areas after exhausting shifts. She could afford groceries without calculating every item against her remaining budget. Elsie had art supplies and a basketball hoop that neighborhood kids gathered around, her daughter's laughter replacing the silence that trauma had imposed. But Corinne also noticed other things. The black sedan that appeared periodically near her building, never threatening but distinctly present. The way certain store owners greeted her with extra warmth, as if she'd been marked as someone deserving special consideration. The invisible network supporting her had weight and reach that extended beyond anonymous payments. She understood what that meant. What kind of person commanded that level of organized assistance? The word mafia never entered her conscious thoughts, but the understanding existed beneath language, in the recognition that legal channels didn't move with this kind of efficiency or comprehensive attention. Someone outside conventional systems had decided she mattered. The knowledge should have frightened her. Instead, it settled like armor she hadn't known she needed. For 2 years, she'd navigated threats from inside her own home, had calculated every word and action to minimize Dennis's volatile responses. That immediate danger was gone, replaced by protection from shadows she couldn't see, but could feel surrounding her like a boundary she hadn't drawn but was grateful existed. The hospital cafeteria had become her sanctuary during breaks, a space where she could sit with lukewarm coffee and watch people navigate ordinary problems. Their concerns felt almost quaint now. Forgotten lunch money, scheduling conflicts, minor complaints about parking assignments. She envied them sometimes. These colleagues who'd never had to measure their words against potential violence, who returned home to predictable safety rather than calculated chaos. The other nurses had started including her in their social plans more frequently, as if her newfound stability made her accessible in ways she hadn't been before. Coffee after shifts turned into dinner invitations, casual mentions of book clubs and weekend hiking groups. Corinne accepted selectively, testing the waters of normalcy like someone learning to swim after years of only knowing how to tread water. She discovered she enjoyed their company when she wasn't constantly calculating exit strategies or monitoring her phone for crisis alerts. Her own reflection had begun to change in ways that transcended the absence of stress-induced exhaustion. The lines around her eyes remained, but they'd softened somehow, suggesting experience rather than suffering. She'd started buying clothes that fit properly, instead of whatever was cheapest and functional. Small acts of self-regard that had seemed impossibly indulgent when every dollar represented survival calculations. The woman in the mirror was becoming someone she could respect rather than someone she simply endured. November brought the first rain, and Corinne discovered that someone had arranged for a car service to transport Elsie to and from school during bad weather. The driver introduced himself with a photograph ID and letter, explaining he was part of a hospital employee family support program. Elsie accepted the arrangement with the adaptability children showed when life improved. On Thanksgiving, a complete dinner was delivered to their apartment. Turkey, sides, dessert, everything perfectly prepared. The accompanying note said only, "From grateful community members." Corinne and Elsie ate at their small table, just the two of them, but feeling less alone than they had in years. December arrived with its particular challenges: holiday expenses, winter heating costs, the pressure of maintaining normalcy during a season that celebrated family and abundance. Corinne opened her mailbox to find an envelope containing a substantial gift certificate to the local department store, enough to cover Elsie's winter clothes and Christmas presents without the usual financial strain. She sat in her car after work one evening, the engine running but going nowhere, thinking about the invisible hand that had reached into her life and rearranged it toward safety. Someone had seen her struggling and decided to act, not through official channels or public programs, but through private resources deployed with precise attention to her actual needs. The business card remained in her wallet, the phone number memorized, though she'd never called. Part of her wanted to meet this benefactor, to understand the motivation behind sustained generosity, but she suspected that mystery was part of the gift, that knowing might create obligations neither of them wanted, might transform organic assistance into transactional arrangement. Instead, she allowed the help to flow around her, accepting it the way she accepted the ocean's presence in Monterey, constant, powerful, shaping the landscape without requiring acknowledgement or permission. Her life was being reconstructed piece by piece, and she was smart enough not to refuse the scaffolding just because she didn't understand its architectural blueprint. By mid-December, 6 weeks since Dennis had left, Corinne realized she'd stopped waiting for catastrophe. The hypervigilance that had defined her existence for years had begun dissolving, replaced by cautious optimism that felt both foreign and wonderful. She could think about the future without it feeling like a threat disguised as a promise. Elsie thrived in the new environment, her grades improving, her social connections expanding. The haunted quality that had aged her prematurely faded, replaced by the genuine childhood innocence that should have been hers all along. She drew pictures in art class of houses with open doors and skies without clouds, visual representations of interior transformation. Christmas Eve found Leonid at his usual restaurant table, but this time he'd invited a guest. The envelope had been delivered to Corinne's hospital locker 3 days prior, an invitation to dinner at an address she recognized as the establishment where everything had apparently begun, though she only understood that in retrospect. She arrived wearing the same white uniform she'd worn from her shift, having received the invitation too late to go home and change. The hostess greeted her by name and led her to the corner table, where a man sat waiting, his dark suit and controlled posture marking him as someone accustomed to commanding attention without effort. Leonid stood as she approached, a gesture of respect that surprised her. Up close, he was younger than she'd expected, perhaps only a few years older than herself. His eyes held the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much too early, but something else lived there too. A carefully banked warmth that suggested the capacity for more than the coldness his reputation likely required. "Thank you for coming," he said simply, gesturing to the chair across from him. A second-place setting waited, wine already poured, but the atmosphere felt more like negotiation than romance. This was a meeting between two people who understood survival's calculus, who recognized each other as veterans of different wars. Corinne sat carefully, her nursing training making her aware of his measured breathing, the tension he carried in his shoulders despite his relaxed appearance. "You're the one who's been helping us," she stated rather than asked. "The job for Dennis? The grants? All of it. Why?" "Your daughter asked me to scare away her monsters," Leonid answered, his voice low enough that surrounding conversations couldn't intercept. "She offered me 3/4. I told her she'd already paid enough." The explanation was both complete and insufficient, like summarizing an ocean by describing water. Corinne absorbed this, her mind connecting the dots between Elsie's unexplained contentment that week and the systematic dismantling of their previous life. She came here? Alone? The mother in her recoiled at the danger her daughter had courted, even as the survivor in her recognized the desperate logic behind it. "She was brave," Leonid said, "and strategic. She chose correctly. I'm not the kind of man who hurts children." The distinction was important, the acknowledgement that he was dangerous but directed, capable of violence but not indiscriminate with it. He wanted her to understand the nature of what protected her. They sat in silence, while Corinne processed the information, her hands wrapped around the wineglass without drinking. "I should be afraid of you," she said finally. "I should take my daughter and disappear because accepting help from someone like you comes with costs I can't afford to pay." "You should," Leonid agreed, "but you won't, because you're smart enough to recognize that what I'm offering has no price attached. I'm not building debt or expecting repayment. I'm closing a circle that started decades ago in a different city where a boy hid in closets and waited for someone to notice he needed saving. No one came. Now I can be that person for someone else. The honesty was disarming, the vulnerability beneath his controlled exterior visible only because he allowed it. Corinne saw the child he'd been in the man he'd become, recognized the wound that had never fully healed despite the power he'd accumulated around it like scar tissue. "What happens now?" she asked. "Dennis is gone. We're stable. You've done what my daughter asked. Does this end here?" Part of her hoped yes, that they could return to normal life without the complexity of ongoing connection. But larger part already knew the answer before he spoke. "That depends on what you want," Leonid said carefully. "I can step back, maintain distance, ensure the support systems stay in place without requiring your awareness or involvement. Or we can acknowledge that something exists here beyond debt repayment, that two people who understand survival might benefit from knowing each other exist in the world." Corinne felt the weight of the choice he was offering, safety with anonymity versus connection with complications. She thought about Elsie, about the life they were building, about whether there was room in it for someone whose protection came wrapped in shadows and unspoken history. The answer surprised her with its simplicity. "I think," she said slowly, "that I'd like to know the person who saved us. Not because I owe you, but because Elsie chose you out of everyone she could have asked." Children see things adults miss. Maybe she saw something worth trusting. The words felt like stepping off a cliff, but she'd survived worse falls. Leonid's expression shifted incrementally, the careful control relaxing into something approaching genuine pleasure. "Then we'll take it slowly," he said. "No expectations, no obligations. Just two people who've been through things others don't understand, finding whatever comfort exists in mutual recognition." They talked through dinner about surface things, Monterey's weather, the hospital's recent renovations, Elsie's improving school performance. But beneath the mundane conversation flowed deeper current of understanding, the recognition that they were building foundation for something neither could fully name, yet but both were willing to explore carefully. The restaurant's ambient noise created a cocoon around their conversation, other diners providing cover through their own oblivious engagement. Corinne found herself studying the way Leonid's hands moved when he talked, economical gestures that suggested someone accustomed to making every movement count. There was precision in how he cut his food, how he lifted his wine glass, how he folded his napkin between courses. A waiter approached to refill their water, and she noticed how Leonid tracked the movement without seeming to, his awareness extending beyond their table in ways that never fully relaxed. It was the same hypervigilance she'd developed living with Dennis, but refined into something more controlled, more purposeful. She recognized it because she'd lived it, understood that some people never stopped scanning for threats even when surrounded by apparent safety. When the waiter left, Leonid's attention returned completely to her, that total focus that made her feel simultaneously visible and safe. He asked about her work with genuine interest, listening to her explanations of emergency department protocols and difficult cases without the glazed expression most people adopted when medical details became technical. His questions were intelligent, probing, suggesting someone who understood complex systems and how they succeeded or failed under pressure. Weeks turned into months. Leonid appeared at irregular intervals, sometimes at the hospital parking lot at shift end, offering rides home, sometimes at Elsie's school events, a quiet presence in the back row who left before anyone could question his attendance, sometimes in phone calls late at night when Corinne couldn't sleep, his voice a steady anchor against her lingering anxieties. The relationship developed in gestures rather than declarations. Flowers continued arriving, but now with cards signed simply L. Medical conferences appeared on her schedule with registration mysteriously paid, opportunities for professional development that she'd never have pursued without the financial freedom to take time away from extra shifts. Elsie's college fund grew from contributions that appeared without fanfare or expectation. In return, Corinne offered what she could: her presence, her conversation, her willingness to see him as more than the sum of his reputation. She didn't ask about his business or the details of how he'd orchestrated their rescue. She simply accepted that he existed in moral complexity, that good and bad weren't binary choices but spectrums most people navigated with varying degrees of success. By spring, they'd developed a rhythm that felt sustainable, regular dinners where they talked about everything except the power structures that defined his professional life, walks along the beach where Elsie collected shells, and Leonid taught her to identify different species, quiet evenings where he read reports while Corinne graded Elsie's homework, their silence comfortable rather than heavy. One morning in early April, Leonid stood across the street from Monterey Bay General, watching Corinne exit after her night shift. Dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, the kind of morning that promised renewal. Elsie ran toward her mother from the car where his driver had picked her up from a friend's house, their reunion a portrait of uncomplicated love. He smiled, watching them, the expression transforming his usually severe features into something approaching peace. The gesture felt unfamiliar, muscles moving in ways they'd forgotten, but genuine in its spontaneity. He'd spent years building an empire on fear and control, creating safety through intimidation and strategic violence. But 3/4 from a desperate child had shown him that protection could take different forms, that power could be deployed toward preservation rather than destruction. Corinne looked up and saw him standing there, her hand rising in a wave that acknowledged his presence without requiring his approach. The gesture said everything necessary, that she knew he watched over them, that his protection was both accepted and appreciated, that whatever existed between them was being allowed to develop at its own pace without pressure or expectation. Leonid returned the wave before turning to leave, his steps lighter than they'd been in years. A child had asked him to scare away monsters, and in the process of fulfilling that request, he'd discovered that the most persistent monster had been the one living inside himself, the belief that redemption was impossible, that his past had foreclosed his future, that men like him couldn't participate in the ordinary grace of connection and care. Elsie had paid him 3/4 and unknowingly purchased his liberation from that prison. Now, watching her laugh in her mother's arms under a breaking sky, he understood that she didn't need to pay any more. None of them did. They'd all been freed by a transaction that had never really been about money at all. Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you these stories. Until next time, remember that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is ask for help, even from the most unexpected places.